Thanks for coming to Dissolving Borders, put on by the Visual and Critical Studies Department, organized and moderated by art history faculty, Michaela Martigani, who's been at SVA for the past 15 years, and also the founder of More Art.
As Justin said, I'm the executive director of More Art, which is a nonprofit organization that commissions and produces socially engaged public art projects. And we are working now on a series of dual continent public art projects that address the plea of refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants, and migrants. This is just a blurb about our organization. And we started last year with a project titled Nosferatu by Andrea Mastrovito, a hand-drawn animated adaptation of the 1922 film Nosferatu, where the vampire is recast as the unwelcome outsider. And then this coming September, we will launch Night Watch by artist Shimon Atti, a minimal and poetic silent film about recent asylum seekers in New York City, which will be projected on a barge traveling up and down the Hudson and the East Rivers. You know, this is just a mock-up. And finally, next year, Krzysztof Wodiszko will adopt and co-opt the technology of the drone and strategies of surveillance to tell human stories of migration, forced relocation, and sense of belonging in a project on the other side of the Atlantic in Italy. It was this project that led us to the investigation of drones and other surveillance technology. And so tonight I'd like to examine what drones are, what they mean, and what they might mean in the future. So I'll start from the obvious. A drone, as defined by the Oxford English Dictionary, is a pilotless aircraft or missile directed by remote control. Drones belong in a category of unmanned aerial vehicles. One of the first recorded uses of a UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle, was in July 1849, when Austria launched around 200 pilotless hot air balloons mounted with explosives and sent them toward Venice in Italy. Thankfully, actually, the winds turned around, so the balloons never reached Venice, and actually a lot of them went back, beyond the Austrian lines. So similar balloons were actually then used by both the Union and the Confederacy in the American Civil War, but it was Nikola Tesla who's responsible for the development of the drone as we know it today, because at the end of the 19th century invented wireless vehicles that use radio signals. And here I have a chart. This is looking at more recent history of drones, especially in the US. According to Dr. Ian Shaw from the University of Glasgow, this evolution can be understood as a passage of 5 overlapping phases. In the early 20th century, first the drone was used as a practice target for military forces. Then in the interwar period between the First and Second World War, the drone was used as a flying bomb that could be delivered behind enemy lines. Then during the Cold War, it was used as a surveillance platform that could gather intelligence in forbidden areas. And then ever since the so-called War on Terror, from 2001 on, the drone has been used as a combined hunter-killer, so both for surveillance and weaponization. And finally, in the 5th stage, the drone is also being used as a policing technology in domestic law enforcement. For sure, it was in the War of Terror that it was the war that played a crucial role in the weaponization of drones, giving them the capability to take out designated targets. But showing also their disastrous limitations at that. What is also most important to note is how much this more diffuse use of drones for state power mirrors the increasingly amorphous and insidious boundaries of the contemporary battlefield. I mean, a very far cry from armies meeting in a battlefield, on a battlefield up until the turn of the 20th century. The driving force behind the development of drones was it would provide a cheaper and safer way to fight wars. However, while the government maintains their crucial role for fighting wars more efficiently and saving lives, human rights activists have criticized drones for the continued lack of accuracy and for the incredible devastation and loss of lives they've generated. Drones have become symbols of power, and who holds it? If indeed drones save lives, it begs the question of which lives we are referring to. As they also become increasingly used in domestic law enforcement, drones offer more intimate but also more invasive forms of control. Currently, robotics manufacturers are working on the development of micro drones and nano drones that can range in size from a hummingbird to an insect. And advances in artificial intelligence are enabling nano drones to cooperate in constellations called swarms, which with the potential to survey urban landscapes in ways and areas that current surveillance equipment cannot. And in 2015, North Dakota became the first US state to legalize so-called less than lethal weaponized drones, which means flying drones that have now been outfitted with tear gas, rubber bullets, tasers, etc. for police use. So, from all we've said so far, it's clear that the history of drones is one tied to death, war, surveillance, intrusion, and specifically power or the abuse of power. But we are actually here today to see how drones have been revisited, reinterpreted, reclaimed in different ways and for different purposes. First of all, while drones have until recently been accessible to government agencies only because of high costs and expertise requirements, they are becoming increasingly accessible to the public for just recreational use. Today, drones are used in a multitude of civilian uses, besides marital squabbles, also to monitor climate change and deliver goods and medicine and filming, photography, agriculture, scientific research, and sporting events, entertainment, etc. With the advance in technology, drones have experienced rapid growth in consumer electronics. For example, the use of smartphones have reduced the price of microcontrollers and camera sensors, which have made drones much cheaper and more accessible. So, for example, you may have heard of Prime Air. Amazon is experimenting with this package delivery drones. They claim they can deliver packages very accurately in about half an hour in other rural or remote locations, Prime Air. But drones can be used in marine research to observe marine animals in a non-invasive way and to keep poachers away, while also removing the risks of having scientists on a boat in the middle of the ocean. In Kenya, drones equipped with infrared cameras have been used in the national parks and reserves to give rangers 24 hours aerial surveillance for poachers, but of course also to help tourists spot, their favorite species. Why not? Digital Democracy, an American nonprofit that seeks to empower marginalized communities to use technology to defend their rights, helped indigenous people in Guyana to build a drone to monitor and document how gold miners are rapidly destroying large sections of the rainforest. And another high-profile examples of how drones can be used to raise awareness was the contested construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline near the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota. Drones capture footage that drew national attention to Standing Rock and helped define the narrative. But of course, drones also sparked, tense encounters with law enforcement. Drones were used after the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, the earthquake tsunami in Japan in 2011, and the earthquake in Nepal in 2015, just to name a few, to provide rescue and search operations. Drone Adventures, for example, is a Swiss nonprofit that uses drones to provide humanitarian help after such disasters. Drones have also been used to detect and disarm landmines, to deliver contraception, blood, and medicine in rural Africa, even though the Red Cross has had troubles using drones for humanitarian purposes, because they're often met with suspicion and mistrust by local communities, especially in areas where weaponized drones have been used in the past. So even though the civilian and humanitarian uses are becoming widespread, still to many people, drones are primarily synonymous with surveillance, military weaponry, and war, rather than with empowering humanitarian causes. In other words, drones suffer from an image problem, have been from the very beginning predominantly seen as invasive, dangerous, and a threat to personal safety and privacy. This is a drawing from Odilon Redon from 1878 called the eye balloon, and that sort of shows even back then there was a certain mistrust of this flying machine that could overlook the land, together with, of course, the excitement for the new technology. So drones have become convenient targets to the point of being demonized in debates about surveillance, citizenship, and technology. But of course, these debates are not really about drones. The debates are over the dynamics of power and the representation of that power. So here is where art comes in. Art can help push the boundaries not only of what drones can do, but more importantly, how they're perceived by the general public. Artists don't care about accepted binary systems. They take technology at face value and question the use and representation of power. So today we have here three amazing artists and innovators, and I will let them elaborate on all these issues. But let me first introduce them. First we have Krzysztof Wodiszko, who was born in Poland and lives and works in New York City and Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's internationally renowned for his large-scale projection on architectural facades and monuments, and he's a pioneer in exploiting new cutting-edge technology to engage marginalized communities, from homeless individuals to veterans to battered women, and strengthen their voice and impact on society. He has realized 90 of such projections in 20 countries, and he's held major retrospective exhibitions all over the world and exhibited at Documenta, Venice Biennale, Whitney Biennial, Montreal Biennial, Liverpool Biennial, and so many more. Krzysztof Wodiszko is a former director of the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT from 1991 to 2010, and since 2010 is a professor of art design and the public domain at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Then we have Nadav Assor, who's born in Israel and lives and works in Providence, Rhode Island. Nadav's work explores ways in which military industrial systems of technological mediation, from eye tracking cameras to drones to telepresent robots, can be critically repurposed to function as a means for creating communities, connection, and human dialogue. Astor's videos, installation, and performances have been exhibited across North America, Europe, and Asia. And actually, there is an exhibition right now at Columbia University. Nadav Assor is an associate professor at the Connecticut College Studio Art Department, which is also the associate director of the Ammerman Center for Arts and Technology. And we actually have here also the co-curator of exhibition, Liv Alexander. And finally, Andy Trench is an artist, innovator, and entrepreneur living and working in Rhode Island, who has gone from studying painting at RISD to funding tech startups based on an obsession with unmanned aircraft, now called drones. In 2015, Andy founded ZatSense, that was one of the first companies offering laser scanning drone payloads and large heavy lifting drones for survey and mapping. Now he's leading a new team and a company called Verspec, and he plans on revolutionizing cell tower inspection and vertical infrastructure assessment. So I'll let him tell you about that. So each panelist has about 10 to 15 minutes for a brief presentation, and then we will have time for questions.
I would like to start with my earlier projects, because in fact, for me it's more of an opening of a possibility of moving into drone technologies. But I would like to bring some of my earlier work in relation to the topic of dissolving borders. Sure, in fact, borders are pretty much dissolving because maybe tens of millions of migrants are crossing borders right now, maybe 50 million. So, yes, they are, but also there is European Union, with dissolved borders. But somehow this doesn't mean that the borders are dissolved, because crossing and dissolving external borders seem to be created internal borders. The borders between those who flee, usually the war zones, civil wars in their own countries, and entering the places that are seemingly offering, or at least potentially, refuge for them, they feel as if they're creating new war zones themselves. So this, of course, brings many other issues here to take into consideration. First of all, the role of public space, which is supposed to be place of communication, a place open to anybody, doesn't belong to anyone, and who is recognizing only those who bring new meaning to it, place the recognizing each other, people can recognize each other and spread the issues of rights. This is a public space. Those immigrants are coming from other places. They usually are, in fact, populating public spaces, and they seem to be not very much in a position to take advantage of this democratic expectation attached to public space. So any projects that will actually help to deal with the new borders created between them and the locals would probably help. This is the case of such a border. The border is between the couple on the right and the person on the left. The couple on the right seem to be afraid of the person on the left. So they seem to be trying to deport him with their gaze. He is looking somewhere else because, well, that's the only defense he can have. But he actually could say lots of things about not only himself or those two people, but society at large. He is the person who came from somewhere else. He is a prophetic, potentially, figure. Why are they actually so afraid of him rather than learning from him? Well, because they repressed their own strangeness over years, since the beginning of their lives. They've been trained to suppress their own strangeness and feel as similar as others, meaning being the sames. Being the sames, meaning not the others. So their common identity is suppressing the difference between them, their own strangeness, and then, of course, when they see the actual stranger, it's uncanny. Something comes to light that ought to be hidden. So, of course, they would rather deport him rather than to face their own strangeness, which is invoked by such close contact with the stranger. So, the possibility is, in terms of media, public space and media in public space, is to create something in between him and them that will help him to open up with unsolicited act of speech and share what's inside of him, his heart, stomach, and mind, and also help them to listen, to open up, come closer, without so much fear. So there is some artifice needed. And that's what in 1990s I started to design. So I'm bringing it up because it's not a drone, but, it's a kind of technical device which contains immigrant stories and transmitted through the top of the stick, and also contains precious relics that are witnesses and documents and kind of artifacts that relate to displacement. So this kind of situation, of course, invites a contact, which normally would not easily happen. This artifice is also kind of transitional object. It actually helps to develop capacities to communicate in public space. Now, this in itself helps those people to also live a healthier life with their trauma, because their displacement is connected with traumatic experiences. Those experiences actually are making impossible for them to speak often. Once they hear what they're saying, already stop speaking because it's so difficult. Learning how to speak in public and share it with people in public space, their difficult stories, is also the way to live healthier with one's own trauma. This psychoanalyst, Pierre Janet, called this presentification. So there's actually, in psychoanalytical practice, public space is also seen as healing environment. So border is still there. One must recognize the border in order to actually speak, and maybe even take advantage of this new border to start communicating. The strangers can communicate, but they have to recognize their own strangeness. So those are various relics, artifacts that are contained. There are also other versions of this stick with electric sensing technology that I developed at MIT with my interrogative design group. Don't have time to go through this. Also, there are some other cultural prosthetic type of equipment that may actually be a combination of gag and megaphone. So the issue is not just to resolve any problem, but actually to articulate the problems through those designs, so we can really make connection with the complexity of the issue. So the fear and entertainment, instruction and pleasure, all of those things could be combined in artifices like this, which I call cultural prosthetics. So just to illustrate how those equipments worked, I have just, it would be good to maybe have a little less light, if possible, because we see more details. Wow. That's better. Thank you. So you could see those relics here, and all those elements that are helping people to start communication, ask questions, and creating a special place in the city, the kind of sacred place in which passion can be exchanged, the communication can happen. When I am thinking about drones, I still think maybe there is a potential there to create such intermediate situation, in which will combine the fear of surveillance and also the fear of invasion, invaders coming from other countries, and at the same time curiosity and some kind of spectacular aspect, a possibility of making communication with those strangers. Also, another aspect of this, that using technology that seem to be implicated in the most difficult experiences, in fact, bloody conflicts and losses and trauma, could also be used to counter this, to actually create a situation of peaceful situation, at least a situation in which people will communicate rather than kill each other. I mean, exchange, confront their positions perhaps, but without blood. So this situation I explored through other projects, which were a combination of those technical devices that help people to open up and interrupt the silence, the lack of interest, lack of curiosity, including the use of military equipment, replacing in Humvee and other military vehicles the section which is used for launching projectiles with equipment that is throwing images and sound, projectors and so forth. So this of course possibility is to move this somewhere. So drones, of course, belong to this category of offensive equipment that is actually carrying projectiles. Well, maybe they could also carry projectors. In fact, they do carry projectors already. There are lots of projects that attach projectors to drones. But so I thought, okay, it's not a very original thing, but at the same time, it seemed to be potentially very interesting chance for me to move forward with those artifices, communicative artifices, performative media in public space. So those, of course, it's very difficult to explain without showing some video. So here, war veterans are sharing with people who never really went to war, that understand what war trauma is, what's what used to be called shell shock at the First World War, meaning 100 years ago, and now it's called flashback, or all sorts of terminologies are developed to describe how soldiers who came back from war zone are behaving and responding to various situations in a way that they look like they're crazy. So this kind of sharing this with people through public space, of course, sometimes it takes a year or half a year or more of work to actually figure out what to say, how to speak. Now, using military technology and also speaking with the sound of weapons, actually kind of continuing the war, because that's what they know how to do. But in order to avert next war, or at least reduce the possibility of another bloody conflict. So this, of course, is not the end of my projects that somehow employ the kind of war technology, war-related technology. One of the project is the war veteran helmet, which I tested only so far in Poland with some war veterans, and also with younger people who would like to know more what it feels to actually be in a veteran, war veteran. So here there is a helmet which contains it's a helmet, but it's equipped with all sorts of media to help war veterans to operate in public space without too much of kind of reactions that are typical for them. They always feel that there are snipers everywhere, that somebody is coming closer to them, especially in shopping malls or stations, train stations, and crowded places. Crowded places are the worst places for veterans, because that's where most likely attacks can happen, especially in contemporary civil war situations like in Iraq and Afghanistan. So to have possibility for them to see more what's happening around, have additional camera, but also possibility to project what they feel, maybe using images that they film themselves. Many veterans are using cameras just to share. So this is basically self-protection in terms of surveillance in order to protect oneself against excessive stimuli, and also possibility of projecting one's own experiences on the ceilings of various places. So we could also they have to see what they project, or maybe before they project. So there's some possibility of editing what they are trying to share with others. Of course, it looks like a helmet, and it's not a helmet. So it's made of something that is familiar, yet it is strange. So the estrangement is important. I just wonder how much of this kind of experience I could continue and invest in drones. So with this, I should actually end my presentation, because there is not much time to elaborate, except maybe I can show some sketch, which I haphazardly made. Of course, inspired by people who will be speaking after me, who really know much better this technology. What a possibility of drone that is operated by those who are on the other side of this new border, for example, immigrants, illegal immigrants, for example, people who are enslaved in some situations, contemporary slavery, who cannot really open up and speak with their open face and directly, but who might take advantage of intermediate equipment such as surveillance equipment like drones. And rather than being surveilled, in some ways, comically surveilled themselves. So the fear of, the reverse of the fear also can have a comical aspect. So, you know, I fear, but I laugh. You know, it's absurd, ridiculous. Yes, it has something weird and something close to my own worries and fears. So this combination might be a very good way, Brechtian way, perhaps, you know. I laugh when you cry, I cry when you laugh. This kind of actually positive, creative use of alienation effect, of which Brecht was speaking. Estrangement from my own estrangement, alienation from alienation. This kind of strange conditions can be created with artifices that actually are made of something we are afraid, yet at the same time are attractive and create curiosity, but on condition that this will be really a feedback, it's a communicative system, not something that simply invades from outside. So let's imagine that those who are on the other side of this new border actually are operating those drones and telling things of which perhaps we don't immediately want to hear, but they are worth risk-taking listening. Those people could also see us, so through some cameras. Now, of course, we could also see them on our cell phones and mobile phones. We can have their eyes and their voice. We can actually see in our cell phones at the same time. So we could actually then speak back to them through our cell phones or through some special microphones set up in public space. So they will be crossing this border between them and us through this very strange equipment. Perhaps we could speak back with them. I mean, we had a long conversation before this session, people who will be speaking, all of us today, and we generated all sorts of options, possibility, potential use, to make sense of this naive drawing, you know? So maybe move ahead various stages of experiments and production. Maybe we can come back to this later. So anyway, thank you very much.
Hi everyone, I'm Nadav, and I wanted to just start by thanking Michaela and Jeff and More Art and SVA for having us here. And also, actually wanted to thank Christoph because one of the things that kind of launched me in terms of inspiration was seeing some of his work, like early 2000s, I think it was, at a Center for Digital Art in Israel. So it's a really nice thing to be now kind of in this conversation. And you know, you'll definitely see how I think, right, to me, the work there are some conversations happening within the work too. So the work I'll be focusing on a very specific subset of my work. And I'm starting specifically with a couple images that have nothing to do with drones, at least superficially. But this image and this one too have to do again with this idea of repurposing, right? So some of what Mika actually mentioned, right? This kind of military, industrial, or market research, in this case, technology, this idea of tracking where your eyes look. But that's something that's present in a lot of my work, this idea of mediating bodies through technology. So, you know, you could have very direct interaction with the person in front of you. We often choose not to, right? Just go on the subway in New York, right? So that's kind of, but using these technologies that are often generate this estrangement or this alienation and intentionally kind of repurposing to do something else, right? Like here is, this is a still from a video in which a healer and a security guard and bounty hunter, I guess, part-time as well, are both kind of scanning each other, right? They do similar choreographies with their hands, right? So this idea of kind of detecting something in the other person. And this is kind of mediated through their eyes, right? So their eyes become this lens, this organic lens that kind of mediates the story. And they kind of interrogate or ask each other questions about their lives and so on. So all of my work really deals with these kind of nonfiction materials that get translated through the body and through technology. So that interest led me a few years ago, about 5 years ago or 6 years ago, to getting interested in drones and in the different kind of relationships that people were kind of building with them. Because drones are essentially, they're this cluster of technologies, right? They're not one thing, you know, and you saw that in Michaela's introduction. But they are, what they are is they are bodies, right? And that's why it's interesting to me as somebody who works with bodies and with mediation, with technology, because it's really, their bodies are something that generates passion, they generate feeling, they generate relationships, right? So that's why people, you know, in a sense, you know, drones are a perfect symbol of so many things, right? Of state power, of oppression, or of, you know, advanced technology, or of, you know, so they draw people, whether they're hobbyists or they're literally feeling the impact of this technology in different ways. But they also, to me, and again, that's something that actually was kind of referenced a bit before, they kind of resonate with some older ideas, right? So what Michaela mentioned with the big eye balloon, right? So this idea of some higher thing, right? Literally higher, right? That kind of can see everything you're doing, or is controlled maybe remotely by some other power. You know, people had names for that, right? Thousands of years ago. It's not a new thing. And the people who kind of constructed the drones, specifically in the military and later in other parts of the industry, are not blind to that either, right? So the first task force of armed drones in Iraq was called Task Force Odin, right? So after the Norse god, right? And Odin had, in Norse mythology, ravens that flew around the world with his eyes in their beaks, right, to see what's going on. And indeed, the first kind of hand-launched military drones were called ravens, right? So that kind of mythology gets perpetuated. But I was interested in how you could, again, kind of reappropriate that to create just a moment of pure encounter. So I was interested in that kind of particular mythological being you're seeing on the right. They're called Ophanim. It's a kind of angel in kind of Judeo-Christian mysticism, mythology. There's a particular chapter in the Bible, Ezekiel, first chapter of Ezekiel, where he describes, it's a very influential chapter. Basically, a lot of Jewish, Christian, and even Muslim mysticism, big chunks of it are drawn out of these several pages long chapter, because that's the one that describes the physical forms of the angel and the chariot of God and all those things, right? And this one is interesting because that's the only one that's not human or animal shaped, right? It's like they're spinning wheels with eyes all over them and with wings all over them. And they're remotely controlled by another angel who's human shaped, right? So it's kind of a strange, like that angel's spirit goes into them. So that kind of led me to do this thing. So that was one of the things that led me to do this. Another thing was thinking about, again, these things that you see here, you never really see them that way, right? So I'm really happy Andy brought this giant guy especially, because really, this encounter with the other, with the body of the other, that happens whether the other is a person or an animal or, human, non-human, machine, right? But there's always this kind of element of fear, this element of like communication that fails or not, right? All of those things. And I was really interested in how you could condense that and take those reactions that people anyway have to these machines that are usually invisible or just like symbols and make it concrete in a, more, let's say, gallery setting. So this is just an excerpt from that installation. Kaldofan. Oh wait, we're not getting the sound actually. Why are we not getting the sound? One moment. That should do it. Okay. So this drone is basically sitting in the gallery and waiting. It's kind of humming to itself. It sings "Someone to Watch Over Me" sometimes, you know, that song. And then when somebody comes into the gallery and stands in front of it, it rises. So what you're seeing it doing, it's basically chanting that whole first chapter that I mentioned from the book of Ezekiel. So it's chanting those verses. I recorded those with the, so that's fairly kind of monotonous kind of chanting, right? It's style of it sounds kind of similar to, for example, a call to prayer, right? Like a Muslim call to prayer. But it's actually not. It's actually a Yemenite Jewish cantillation, which is musically it's you know, from the same background. So and what's interesting about that, because it's basically a drone, right? So it's a vocal drone. So the cantor that I worked with pitched his voice so it, you know, harmonizes with the rotors basically. And it does get seizures sometimes, like any, you know, living being. It's not always in control. So it gets overtaken by live military radio broadcasts, because this was first installed in Israel, and one of the biggest, most popular radio stations there is, oddly, it's like the military radio station. It broadcasts like pop music and that kind of thing most of the time, but that's the power structure, right? So I wanted to make that kind of come through sometimes, right? So sometimes that's what you hear. Wait, I showed you that. And another, you know, looking again into these kind of bodies and the way that you encounter them, I was also interested in how they actually, there's almost something paradoxical in working with these machines, because what drones have allowed an increasing community of civilians, right? So they certainly, we all know, we've heard about like military drone operators that sit in Vegas in a, you know, container or something and get PTSD from, like, you know, bombing people on the other side of the world. And of course the people there, for everyone it's this weird disembodied experience, right? For the people there, they hear this buzzing but they don't know where the machine is. And then there was a growing civilian population that was interested in working with drones as these kind of out-of-body machines, right? As these machines where you can look into the camera, into your screen or goggles, and see the point of view of the drone, right? It's actually how I met Andy, because I was starting to get really interested in the community of kind of hobbyists and hackers that do that and their view on things. But I was also interested in people that explicitly combine the stuff I was talking about before, the almost kind of religious or mythological thing, because it's this, you know, out-of-body experience. Again, that's not a new thing, right? People have been trying to do that for a very long time. Usually you needed to die or to nearly die or take a lot of drugs or something like that. But you know, now you can do it for a couple $100s with this machine. So I found this guy who had a website called fleshpilot.com, and he was really talking about that. So we shot a short documentary with him called Lessons on Leaving Your Body. So I'll show you a very short excerpt from that. But that's basically about how he uses drones as a conscious religious kind of instrument, right? So he uses that to leave his body in order to kind of also, I mean, he experienced a period in his life where he basically felt remotely controlled. So he kind of transformed that by taking control of this technology. He builds them from like foam and like rotors. It's completely handmade, like highly sophisticated handmade stuff, and he's got incredible control of it. But for him, it's like prayer, flying them, right? So show an excerpt from that. No, come on, Wi-Fi.
Your flesh is not who you are. You're flying in that flesh. You're a flesh pilot. I'm a flesh pilot. You're a flesh pilot. So you can be in that helicopter and see me looking at me, and then leaving and taking off away from me and coming back and wandering around, and my body's just completely a rock. It's not even moving. It's just sitting there, you know. So my soul's now in a different kind of a cockpit, flying in another body.
So that's a short excerpt. It's a 15-minute long film, and it goes through this whole process, and the drone crashes in the ocean, and we rebuild it, and he talks about his life and so on. So there's a lot more to it than that. It's basically a collaboration in that he's doing this thing that is normally not done much in FPV, which is shooting himself as much as possible, which can be pretty disorienting. You know, you don't want to fly your external point of view into yourself when you're doing that. And we did it ultimately in the kind of jungle-like woods of the Olympic Peninsula. And, you know, he was flying the drone around and kind of going through kind of early stages of his life. It was interesting. It was very, it was an interesting experience. One thing I forgot to mention, or really important about fun about this project, is it wouldn't have existed without Andy, who's here. So he was responsible for kind of building the main bulk of this thing. Another artist, also Brian Dimmock, also helped me with that. So I want to kind of conclude with a couple things that are more recent. And, you know, I've been thinking a lot about these different trajectories, right? So this idea of out-of-body machines, right? That on one hand are these physical bodies, on the other hand, they allow the distribution or dislocation of bodies, and how it's kind of like almost in opposition to this other trend of how, you know, capital, data, all those things get consolidated, right? So it's kind of like these weird opposing trends that happen in the world. And how you can almost kind of trouble that, or think about what constitutes a body, how far you can push these kind of different constituent parts, and, you know, really thinking about if even this idea of drones as a dronosphere, as a bunch of spectrums, because really you can push, you know, like at the heart of certainly the smaller drones today is basically this, right? That's why drones are cheap, because they contain pretty much the same electronics as this thing. Slightly fancier versions in certain cases with a few more sensors, but that's the idea. It's mobile processors, cameras, you know, tilt sensors, things like that. So, you know, me walking around with this is basically, you know, now this has mobility, right? If this gives me instructions because somebody else is sending them, then I'm like a drone, right? So you have these different axes where you can really kind of push things in different directions. So you can start thinking about how drones are becoming more maybe animal-like or biological inspired or human-like. Humans are also maybe becoming more dronified, right? So certainly if you've seen like the way Amazon warehouses work, right, with digital devices that tell people, or the way you work when you navigate with GPS, right? So that's kind of something I've been thinking about, and a project that really, I think, relates to some of what we're thinking about with Christoph now too, is a project I did a couple years ago called Future Absentees, which was basically creating these two monoliths, right? These two kind of black monoliths with like old school TVs on them. And those TVs can rotate. They're like heads, right? So it's kind of like two immobile bodies with just heads that can turn around. And they are basically, you know, you could call them drones or avatars or however you want to call it, right? They're like really primitive telepresence robots. Those are becoming popular if you've seen those. That's how Snowden speaks at conferences. So they're like iPads on Segways, basically. So this is kind of the dumb immobile version. But the idea is that I got, this is kind of a pop-up show on a repurposed railway that's in between Jewish and Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem. And this was a show that actually dealt with the future, right? It dealt with actually 100 years to 1948, so 2048, which is, you know, to Palestinians, that's called the disaster, right? The Nakba, and to, you know, some of the Jewish residents of Israel, it's the Independence War or Independence Day, so it was dealing with this very loaded subject matter. And of course, this idea of absentees are a big thing too in Jerusalem and in Israel in general, because there are people that left, right, and they can't really come back, or won't come back, or in most cases can't. So the idea here was to give over these avatars to various people from various, you know, backgrounds that are not there for various reasons. They can't physically be there, they don't want to be there, various reasons. So they would project themselves into those two bodies, and they would have a camera, and they can control the head, right? And they can talk with each other. So they were like these conversation pairs, right? People would project and have a conversation for half an hour, and then the next pair would come on. But they can also turn their head to the microphone, right? So people that walk by can have a conversation with them, right? So it can become something unexpected, right? So I'll show like a 1-minute excerpt documentation of how that looked.
I don't think they're advancing, you know, I mean, I think that's the question. I mean,
Oh, and the one other important thing is they were indeed positioned as oracles, right? So the idea was that they're talking about the future, right? So people could ask them questions about the future, or they could express their opinion and that sort of thing.
I don't think they're advancing, you know, I mean, I think that's the question. I mean, where are we moving? I mean, this idea of the rationality of time, you know, moving forward. And I think that we sort of are in a stop. I mean, the notion of the future in the past used to be this idea of a temporal horizon, that the future was ahead. But I think right now we are in an infinite present.
I'm very much worried about what is going on in Turkey, especially recently, which makes me very much worried about the future. And
I can't go back to Iran. Like, I haven't been back to Iran for 5 years now, you know. And the only like relationship now I have to Iran is like virtual. Celebrating like Nowruz and Persian New Year on Skype with my family, to just like talking with my friends too.
I was just asking the name of the equipment.
It's called the one. And it's on the border between the two nations. It's a Afghan and the
So I'll kind of wrap up with that because I know we're short on time. I will just mention, because, you know, because it's running now, that there is, this is kind of the flip side of the project you just saw, because this is a project where people can kind of leave virtualized versions of themselves, kind of leave these embodied messages for you in a space, and you have to come to that space to experience that. It's called Titchener's Cage, and that's up at the Teachers College of Columbia University in a show called Unleashing. It's curated by Livia Alexander, who's here, and Ishin Onol, whose voice you actually heard in the previous project. She was one of the people who Skyped into those monitors. So, you know, I welcome you to look that up and come visit that. Thank you very much.
My name's Andy Trench. I do own a drone company. I'm kind of version 2.0 of drone company, but I do want to point out that I am on the second half of Michaela's conversation. It was actually in the bylaws of my original company to never arm a drone or to never even put any kind of tracking or any kind of ammunition on one whatsoever. I am coming from art school, But this is what my basement looked like in 2008. I was absolutely obsessed with flying things, I think even from a younger age, but as battery power and electric motors became cheap, affordable, and powerful, and I didn't have to tune a gas motor, I really fell in deep in the RC addiction. I lost my first iPhone 1 duct taped to the front of a foam airplane doing real estate shots, and this was back when nobody had seen a picture of their house from 300 feet. A drone-based photo was a fairly new thing, and unless some guy was coming knocking on your door who had flown a full-scale helicopter around your house for some reason, you didn't see that. And then came this multi-rotor technology, which really allowed us to stabilize a camera in a way that we hadn't seen before. We had less vibration, we had less moving parts, and we had a really simple platform to lift a camera. And I was allowed then to start kind of investing in this technology. It really showed some promise to do work that maybe even benefited the work that my wife and I do. We were in interior design in Rhode Island. We've been building bars and restaurants in Providence and around Rhode Island and New England for quite some time. But that investment led to a scene like this, where I had stabilized handheld camera platforms, multiple heavy lift drones that could carry large DSLRs, and this was before the era of just go to B&H Photo and buy yourself an aerial videography kit. This was a kind of beautiful point in my drone career where I was doing a lot of flying. We were making film and video, and we were doing a lot of creative projects. Being landowners and property owners in Rhode Island, we've done some mill renovation and some rehab projects. This was a church that my wife and I bought probably in 2012 or 2013, but you see this kind of steep pitched roof there, and as a contractor with a short team of guys, I wasn't about to climb on that roof, and I wasn't about to send anybody else up there. And I looked at my fleet of aircraft and I said, what can I carry up there and do this measurement and take measurements with it? And that led me down a bigger rabbit hole, if you can even imagine, of different sensor technologies and different things that were available to me at the time. Really unhappy with the kind of stereo vision, low fidelity measurements I was able to take with that. I found LiDAR, which stands kind of a bastardization of radar, meaning light detection and ranging. So it's sending out a laser pulse and timing that laser pulse on the receiving end and taking a very accurate measurement. At the time, this was expensive equipment. I convinced my wife to allow me to bolt a $30,000 piece of laser ranging equipment to the bottom of a $2,000 toy helicopter. And all under the guise that this was going to help us in our business, by the way, in some fashion. But again, I now had a $30,000 piece of equipment that now needed military-grade GPS and inertial sensing that was far beyond what we could put on these aircraft at the time. And doing some research and talking to some very intelligent people, I was able to find a solution called SLAM, which does not need GPS or IMU. And you can imagine a laser scanner that's seeing this entire room, acting very much like your phone taking a panoramic photograph, as even a small mobile device can do today. It's stitching that photo together, finding similarities in that photograph and stitching it together. So a year after making that proposition and getting that laser scanner, I could then fly my aircraft over that church building and build a centimeter accurate 3D model of the church. So this is a fully measurable, explorable, importable into CAD 3D model of that space. And then ExactSense was born. That really showed us that there was some pretty amazing commercial potential in this technology. I was building these aircraft. It wasn't available to go buy an off-the-shelf system that could lift 12, 15 pounds. So we were carrying the laser scanner, multiple cameras, massive batteries, and this is kind of version 1 of what you're looking at on the ground here. Doing that hardware game and maybe being a little bit early in this kind of mapping and 3D laser scanning phase, I've gone through a lot of growing pains of what it is to take an idea, start a business, learn how to be an entrepreneur. We went through the Mass Challenge program in Boston, which was amazing. Kind of went through CEO whipping and learned how to go from being a creative into being a true entrepreneur where you have to actually make money at the end of the day somehow. So now we have set our sights on one of the main customers that was really knocking on our door for the laser scanning technology, which was the utilities and specifically the telecom industry. And now I'm kind of happy to say that I'm out of the hardware game. I no longer have to buy every new sensor and camera that comes out, and we are moving much more into a software-based the company in general, where we have designed a platform for just about anybody with a drone to be able to do very complex measurement work around a cell phone tower by automating it almost end to end, where we're providing you with the flight plan and everything, and you are basically just the drone carrying the drone to the site and pressing go. And I think that there's a lot to be said about who's in control here in this conversation that we're having today. So being in the drone game for quite some time, this is just kind of a list of where I see the current trends are at, and it's automate, automate, automate. And I really am sorry for the pilots that have kind of just jumped into this game thinking that they're going to go buy a drone for $1,200 and make a profit the next weekend, because the cost and the value of that work is going down so fast. Because just like you went out and bought a drone for $1,200, so did 20 other people. And it's getting easier and easier. This little object that I had in the air at the beginning of my part of this talk is so easy to fly. You could see I can take my hands off the controls. It's got cameras aimed down, it's got distance sensors, and it ultimately flies itself, and you just direct it slightly. Most of the money being made in the drone game today is in the data, in massive amounts of data, and in the mechanisms that are being used to farm actual value out of that data. So the artificial intelligence and the neural networks kind of farming, it used to be garbage in and garbage out. Now it's garbage in and sorted photos and a lot of insight out. The storage and the management of all that data, again, other automated analytics, and 3D processing. So now even with a drone, this is ultimately about $1,000, you can get a very similar model to that 3D laser scan model I did of the church with just 200 photographs from different angles. There's some amazing processing technology out there. There is still money to be made in hardware and kind of specialized payloads, and I'll stress kind of the niche solutions in general. You can't just go out there and say you're good at everything anymore. You kind of have to go and find your market and get known to be good at it. BVLOS or BVLOS is a kind of a new phenomenon where you are not even in visual line of sight of the drone anymore, and this is a big word in the industry now because you want to go do 1,000 miles of power line inspection or something like that, and the FAA says, nope, you are a pilot, you need to be able to see the aircraft and in oncoming traffic and things like that. Delivery, obviously you guys have been hearing a lot about. I think when Amazon Prime first put those pictures out there, like Michaela put up, people were laughing at it saying, not in my lifetime, and I think we're seeing it, coming really fast. And even more surprisingly, probably human transport and human delivery, I think is actually in live trials at this point, and it's coming, might even leapfrog your fully autonomous Uber, especially with the current news of what's going on there. So that kind of brings us into what we're talking about today, and I'm super excited to be kind of drawn back into that creative space. I'm kind of forced, by seeking investment and things like that I have to go out there and work and work and work. I don't get to fly drones very much anymore. A lot of these kind of sit in my office and are kind of example pieces for how other people use them these days. So I'm really excited to get back into a creative project and excited to be here. And that brings us to kind of drones as entertainment piece. And really the majority of what we see as a drone being used as art today is a glorified LED pixel in the sky. Intel's done a very good job at building a system for this. The drone that they're using for it is tiny, it's safe. If you see one of these light shows, it's most likely this piece of equipment right here. And it can be mass produced. It's a single, very bright LED, and there's a ton of intelligence on board this aircraft. And it can do much more complicated things, like I'm sure many people have seen what happened at the Olympics. What most people don't know is the show that they had done at the Super Bowl wasn't done during the Super Bowl. That was done during a controlled event prior, because the FAA doesn't let you fly 1,000 drones over a crowd of people still. Some other pretty awesome examples of drone being used in art. A drone can also have servos on it and control a physical thing other than a gun or a weapon. So this is a pretty cool example of a fairly abstract way of using it. Attaching lights to it and using it as a method to paint in the air. This is really fun to do and really easy, and can be done even with the lights that are just on board the aircraft. So this is kind of a no-brainer. Looking for other examples of interactive art, this is what I find. So I was really excited when Nadav came to me with the proposal. I couldn't really grasp what was going on at the beginning, and I think part of my role in this project was to make sure that he had it tethered to something and that it wasn't going to be unleashed into the crowd. And I was really excited with how it came out, and really excited that kind of started this conversation. This is a very good example of maybe a drone doing it, and this was done automatically. This is a drone's attempt at flying the same pattern and doing some very Andy Warhol-like art. Now, if you're considering doing a drone-based art project, there's a number of things to consider. And at the beginning of that is, are you telling a story, and are you emoting something, or are you showcasing a technology and using this technology to kind of push what it can do and show other people what it can do? If you look up, TED Talks about drones, and you see how they can be coordinated to do things like build a bridge, or they can bounce ping pong balls back together. While that can be possibly considered art, this is mostly done in kind of a technology showcase kind of way. You obviously need to consider the hardware. You have the physical drone to contend with, but most importantly, that flight controller. You can't go and buy a $100 drone on Amazon and expect to be able to program it or to make it do and perform any of these amazing maneuvers. There's awesome open source flight control hardware out there. I happen to be a reseller of one of the better ones. You can find me at Exact Sense on Amazon Prime. You can get one in 2 days. But then, what is that software that you're going to use to even do that programming? The open source path is amazing. These two more kind of commercial kits on the ground are really difficult to work with. You've got an SDK and a very closed system that the manufacturers don't really let you get into the control mechanisms, and you don't get feedback from the aircraft, and they've really kind of limited the ability to go in there and kind of do more interesting things with it. Is your application going to require special software? My mind goes a million places when we go talk about multiple drones performing some amazing choreography, but now I'm developing custom software for a project, and there's quite a long kind of complicated roadmap to get to the end of that. Special sensors and payload, and I've had a great example of he's using proximity sensing, and he's using sound, and he's got a very oddball payload on there. Like, I don't think you're going to see anything like his kit out there anytime soon. Airspace restrictions is absolutely, if you're doing it in this country, one of probably your largest hurdles. I'd say good luck trying to fly anywhere outside in Manhattan, period. Probably for the next 3 years without some extremely special permission or a net over it, for obvious reasons, for nefarious reasons, as well as general airspace and aviation. FAA's got an amazing record. You don't hear about airplanes running into each other very often. Sound is certainly a factor. It's something that we're dealing with in this project. They definitely make a lot of noise. You'd be surprised that that large aircraft actually makes maybe less or about the same amount of noise as this larger one. It's got slower spinning propellers and it pushes air in a different way, in a lower decibel. But it's totally dependent on how much weight is on it. If I weighed it down heavily, it would make a lot of noise. So if you're intending your audience to interact with them, either incorporate that sound into it or be aware that that's going to be prohibitive. And then I can't stress as much this enough, that safety is absolutely on the top of your list for any kind of drone project. I take it very seriously. Anybody purchasing drone equipment from me, I tend to do training if I'm selling somebody an aircraft, such as the one on the floor here, and just pre-flight checks and things like that people just take for granted, that you're going to take it out of the box, put it in the air, and it's just going to do what you tell it to do. Taking care of your equipment or having somebody that is part of the project that is proven to do so, I think is extremely important. It's too easy to go out there. Like I said, you can go to B&H Photo, you can go on Amazon, and you can buy one of these. There's not even any instructions in it. There's nobody telling you that you can't fly in Manhattan, but just do your homework and look into what you're actually allowed to do. That said, thank you.
Yeah. I was wondering what your thoughts are on virtual identity and in relation to the body and the self, and how borders are created through that, and how the virtual space that we inhabit versus the physical space that we inhabit as people, how that reflects in your art, and so on.
Well, it's a big, it's a very big topic, and the project I was showing a glimpse of at the end is most directly involved in that. So, but it's, I feel like it's getting people increasingly. I think it's even hard to say virtual identity, right? Because identity today has components that are online components, that are offline components, that are, not to mention, it's context dependent too, right? That's even not a new thing, right? Like Irving Goffman was talking about that way before virtual, right, existed. But I think it's interesting to kind of look at. I guess the one thing I want to say is to challenge that virtual physical kind of distinction, right? And instead think of how you can actually maybe leverage these fragmented identities, right? There's something that protect a lot of people today too, or there's something that kind of be leveraged in really interesting ways in terms of even artwork too. So the fact that the world looks like 5 different ways, even to a single person, right? Or they can represent themselves in so many different ways.
I can say something quick to this, and less even in a philosophical way or even in a creative way. I've kind of fallen in love with the idea of avataring myself even across the universe. As soon as you put on any kind of modern VR headset and find yourself in a community of other people wearing VR headsets in a room, it was further along than I had even imagined. And I'm maybe not even ready to engage with that community where there are probably rooms full of 12-year-olds somewhere that are. My first reaction was to remove the headset very quickly and turn the machine off as soon as I found myself in a room full of other people and kind of bombarded with, and I had no identity then. I didn't have a self at all, and all I had was my voice and cartoon hands in a virtual space, and it was scary.
I'm curious how you all feel about this idea that, especially you brought it up a little bit in terms of we are almost becoming drones ourselves because we have these phones and we're receiving instructions from elsewhere. And so I think increasingly, as you were talking about this idea of adding automation to everything, how do you feel about eventually this idea of this artificial intelligence taking over and instructing us to do everything and giving ourselves off to that?
Find myself in the futurist position. I think it's an inevitability. So you have to ensure that, you know, your Isaac Asimov laws are being applied heavily and are, you know, that the machines can't hurt us necessarily, but I don't think that they're even instructing us to do. We just end up on permanent vacation and with everything being done. So I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing if you can imagine that gives you a lot of time to be creative.
Well, we always have this, not always, but since the history of modernity is nothing else but continuing projection of the end of the world coming with technological progress. But eventually, actually, we learn how to playfully live with it, but also how to be afraid at the same time. When I look at those drones, it's not only that I'm fascinated that they fly, I'm actually very moved that they are sitting on the floor. So it means they can be attached to the ground and they can see the ground. So there's incredible difference of a perspective. In fact, the drone going very, very low starts attracting me as well. So just keep in mind that every kind of prosthetic device historically was always met with incredible fear. The bicycles, when they started to be popular, were criticized by saying that people stop actually talking to other people. They became alienated, right, from everyday experience, from communicating, because they're too busy, too fast, you know, pacing or crossing the social areas and so forth. The same happened with the headphones, with all of the. There's so much. So I would not, first of all, be very careful about this catastrophic apocalyptic picture. At the same time, we know what's happening with Facebook today, with all of this. There's a big danger and incredible accumulation of data on us. But the question is, who is processing this? Are those hypothetical superpowers capable to process all of this? What they really accumulate? You know better.
But
Who's in charge? I don't know.
well, I mean,
who owns the data is a big question.
I think that, yeah, I mean, of course, I mean, that's what
Do
the
you
big
own all
business is right now, right? So it's processing it, and, you know, I know there, you know, some of you in the room, you already know that, but yeah, I think that's the AI, right? That's the automation, right? Is the processing, or is the, and if you think again about drones and about kind of the history of surveillance, right? So this idea of seeing machines, right? So there's this text called The Vision Machine, right? From, I don't know, 30 years ago or something, by Paul Virilio, and he wrote about how the ultimate vision machine is a machine where the person is taken out of the loop, and it, you know, it sees and it understands what it sees, and it acts on that, and then it accumulates more, and we are totally at that stage in a sense, right? So so I think it's, yeah, I think on one hand, like, again, this dualistic, this kind of reactions of, oh, it's the end of the world, are not productive. But on the other hand, of course, it's, yes, it's inevitable. Well, it's not, no, it's not inevitable. Let's put it this way. I think it's inevitable in a really wide scope of ways, and those have to do with how people react to it and how people kind of, what kind of discourse, public conversation is around it.
Because the surveillance is also in our hands. You know, when there was a very conflictual situations in Warsaw, the group of people use drones to actually surveil the operation of police, and in fact spreading it all over the world. So of course the police is controlling the air and all of the rules, but also there's possibility to counter, especially when they're flying low. You can actually manage pretty much evade some kind of surveillance of your surveillance, and then gradually see some. So I would not. There's a kind of constant kind of interplay between surveillance and counter-surveillance through surveillance, right?
Yep. Yeah. Quickly, kind of talking about technology being feared when it first arrived, and specifically the aircraft. There was an expectation as soon as the aircraft left the runway that it was going to follow government roads only and moved at 90-degree angles, that it never flew over somebody's house, because the belief then was that your property was from the center of the earth through your borders of your property through to the heavens, and that of course is not the case today. And it's not necessarily a popular opinion, but you don't own the airspace over your house, and neither does his neighbor. So if you're if you're flying responsibly in the air, you're not in a national park or in a restricted airspace, you can surveil yourself the actions of a nefarious group or the police in your area, and you have every right to do so as long as you are following those guidelines. And there are different guidelines for hobbyists and commercial use, and we now have very straightforward paths for flying fully legitimately for money and for those commercial use. And it's going to be very interesting to see in the next 2 years if Google and Amazon close up that space, and who gets these kind of airspace rights and shuts me and the other hobbyists and maybe these smaller companies and squeezes us out of that airspace. And I hope that doesn't happen.
Well, I think we are about out of time. So thank you so much for coming. But there is so much more that we could say about, drones and the future of drones, and how it can be used on all sides of the spectrum, as Christophe was saying, for surveillance, counter-surveillance, and it's been sort of pulled in all these different directions. But there is so much potential there with every technology comes around until the next, I suppose. So I hope until next time. Thanks so much for coming.